Hello and welcome to another Blain's Morning Porridge. It's the 7th October 2025. Today, a tale of two cities, Paris and London. As always, let's start with a quote. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. The debt crises that apparently threaten to engulf both London and Paris are very, very different. Paris is in genuine financial and market trouble. London has something of a perception problem. Both crises are rooted in political fiscal miscalculations and the widening polarisation between political populism and conventional politics. The crisis in Paris is very real, but the one in London is largely driven by doom-scrolling financial misdirection of dubious right-wing provenance, looking for opportunities to snipe the current centrist Labour government. Before you read this morning, or before you listen to this edition of the Morning Porridge, I would like you to bear in mind my key Blain's market mantra number 2. Things are never as bad as we fear, but seldom as good as we hope. Now, starting off with the line, "The French are revolting," is one of the great pleasures of being a financial commentator. Paris faces a genuine debt crisis on top of an apparently irreconcilable political impasse. The collapse of cabinet negotiations between left and right triggered the resignation of yet another forgettable prime minister, who had an even shorter shelf life than our own Liz Truss, plunging France into the brutal reality its lack of financial sovereignty, that's because it's a member of the collective of the euro, and its recent debt downgrades leave it looking at the edge of a financial precipice, about to take a step forward. It's all terribly, terribly dramatic, but even I expect the French situation will ultimately be resolved. Internally, France may look like a political battle, but the ECB can't afford European sovereign contagion risk or a French debt crisis to trigger wider instability and recession. At some point, therefore, French government bonds, OATs, may become a screaming buy. In contrast, London has a debt and political perception gap. There are multiple semi-informed doom scrollers drowning the right-wing media, Substack and LinkedIn with lurid tales about the imminent default, a gilt's meltdown, an IMF bailout, or the complete collapse of the nation. Some of the stuff, frankly, makes me giggle in its utter ignorance and inventive mistruths. They all pretty much skip details, but most of the doom scrollsters say that Chancellor Rachel Reeves' incompetence means she won't be able to balance the November budget without the UK exploding in a terminal debt Armageddon. Whatever. It's all terribly riveting and salacious stuff, and it's utter bollocks. The reality is the gilts market is robust and resilient in the face of pretty much normal UK political dither. If I find the time, I'm going to do a piece following up a Porridge debunking of these multiple unfounded rumours and sighs about the imminent death of the gilts market. The problem is they do find traction in the swirling, self-obsessed gloop of right-wing frustration that's dominated the Tory graph since Labour had the temerity to win the last election. But before I go into explaining Paris and London's particulars, let's zoom out a couple of billion miles. Now, a couple of years ago, I came up with something that I called Blain's virtuous sovereign trinity theory, and that postulates 3 factors for a successful economy. The first is currency stability. The second is a sustainable bond market, and the third is political competency. Now, it assumes that a nation has financial sovereignty, meaning control of its own budget process and the keys to the monetary printing press. The UK has financial sovereignty, However, France does not. It's beholden to the European Central Bank in Frankfurt and the EU in Brussels. When it comes to a full-blooded bond market crash, there are actually very few historical examples that have led to a financially sovereign nation collapsing or defaulting. To the best of my knowledge, I think the only ones are when the USA experienced technical defaults in 1930 when they came off the gold standard, and again in 1970 when payments were missed during a government shutdown. And no, I don't actually remember them, but I did read them in a history book. Now, Italy went through a whole series of financial crises innumerable times as they chopped and changed prime minister umpteen times in the 1970s till about 2000. But otherwise, all the major sovereign debt crises that we've ever seen have occurred in emerging nations. That would be names like Turkey, Mexico, Brazil, and repeatedly Argentina. Russia is a serial defaulter, but it hardly counts as a major global economy anymore. These emerging market crises have been triggered by nations that borrow in currencies other than their own, usually dollars, and being unable to repay them when the bonds mature without creating massive domestic currency collapses. Now, any financially sovereign nation issuing debt in its own currency is not going to default. It will repay debt by printing money. Now, that will be inflationary and it might collapse the currency. It's therefore fraught with consequences, but basically financially sovereign countries don't default. It will mean that interest rates will rocket higher because they still need to entice buyers to refinance their maturing debt. And that's basically why successful financially sovereign nations tend to be very prudent. They are very scared of upsetting the bond market, or what people call bond vigilantes. Now, there is also what we call the Ken Rogoff-Carmen Reinhart derived Rogoff rule, that any nation will start to decline once its debt exceeds 90% of GDP. That's because government debt is supposed to crowd out growth and create fiscal instability. But actually 90% is pretty much an arbitrary number, and no one has really ever proved that it's a critical point. Now, the UK's debt is currently 98% of GDP, while France is around 114%. Bear in mind that Japan is at 235%. The key thing is that a nation's bond yield, which is set by demand and supply, in other words, what investors are willing to lend a nation at, that is a critical rate, because that sovereign bond yield sets what we call the risk-free rate. And that risk-free rate is what all other financial assets are priced against. If you mess with the risk-free rate, then the consequences are likely to disrupt the whole economy. Now, we saw that clearly during the quantitative easing era from about 2010 to 2023, when interest rates were pitched too low. That triggered massive inflation in the price of financial assets, but actually drove very little real investment, despite interest rates being artificially low. Now, without doubt, the most interesting crisis I've ever been directly involved in when I was broking large blocks of European sovereign bonds was the sovereign bond crisis of the early 2010s. And that was a crisis that stemmed from European nations that were using the euro suddenly discovering that they lacked financial sovereignty. Greece and other European nations had made the schoolboy error of thinking that their over-hasty membership of the euro had somehow made their triple B, that's a low investment grade domestic economies, into top-notch AAA investment credits. They borrowed themselves to the max, and then they struggled to repay as they discovered their unreconstructed economies were using another nation's currency, i.e. the euro. It left them absolutely crippled. It left them struggling to repay debt. It triggered confusion and panic in the market, and we had what we called pigs, contagion across the bonds of exposed European sovereign credits. Pigs comes from Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain. These were the countries that suffered the most problems. Now, that pigs crisis led to destabilising political dither. The whole of the domestic, basically we had all the domestic European political leaders trying to dodge any notion that there was joint and several liability of other nations' debt that were using the euro. And that was because the idea that German workers would end up paying the pensions of Italian workers was never going to be politically acceptable. Now, it took one of the smartest men in Europe, the genius of the head of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, who later went on to become Premier of Italy, and he set up what we call unlimited bond repos, which effectively made any ECB members' nation's sovereign debt and the banks which were wobbling. It basically made these repos allowed the banks to sell their bonds to the ECB, so they stood behind all the debt. That, together with his do whatever it takes speech, that solved the whole European crisis ultimately. Now, I reckon that Draghi's comment, the do whatever it takes comment, should really stand right alongside Winston Churchill's fight them on the beaches comment. It was a pivotal moment in European history. Now, the EU and the European Central Bank notionally set what European nations can borrow in their debt metrics. There are rules established about how much and what ratios they can borrow at. But it's all basically a bit of a fudge. Nobody really wants to test the concept of debt sovereignty between Brussels and the European nations. And it's a problem that's caught up in the complexities of competing fiscal union alongside monetary union. That's a political union that Brussels wants, but the rest of Europe is pretty much electorally disinterested in. France's problem is going to be persuading Europe to stand behind it so it can continue to borrow to finance the French state. Now, that is going to create a politically unacceptable picture of France being bailed out at the expense of stronger northern European economies. But I'll pretty much guarantee that somehow a fudge will be found. At a time when political and defence unity is required in Europe, it's absolutely critical. And as I noted above, the opportunity for windfall gains in French bonds may present themselves at that point. Now, the situation in the UK is utterly different to the crisis that we're seeing in France. At present, the gilts market is under attack to a degree that I've never seen throughout my whole 40-year career in the bond market. The problem is that the centrist Labour governments has really brought this on itself through misjudged fiscal plans. Although they had years in opposition to learn from the multiple mistakes that the Tories made, particularly Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng when they collapsed the economy, and then Rishi Sunak, who was a lovely chap, but he wasn't a great chancellor, and he was unable to change the Tory party when he was Prime Minister. Despite all that time, Labour came into office in July last year pretty much unprepared for what they found, which surprised all of us who had been trying to tell Labour there's an opportunity here. Rather than use the strength of the massive majority that they won in the election to present a robust and fully costed plan to the financial markets that would have covered the funding black hole that they said they discovered and start rebuilding broken Britain, thus avoiding recession-triggering tax rises, Labour abased themselves to pulsating the bond market by strict adherence to borrowing rules, and effectively they trapped themselves with promises of no tax rises to the electorate. Mistakes were clearly made. Party indiscipline then exacerbate the crisis by denying the government a majority to slash and reform overly generous and unpoliced welfare spending, which, lest we forget, was largely put in place by previous Tory administrations. Now Labour find themselves pretty much trapped, unable to borrow more in fear of the bond market, unable to tax more in fear of electoral wipeout and recession. And that's what the right wing has seized upon to create this uncertainty and instability. But there is no really fundamental crisis in the UK state or the gilts market. Yes, there are difficult decisions to be taken, but we are not about to see a default. We are certainly not going to go to the IMF for a bailout. And the worst possible thing that will happen is that we might see bond yields rise somewhat if there is a crisis, which I doubt is coming. What we're seeing is a continuation of the same fiscal problems that the UK has been facing for decades, balancing spending versus taxes and government. Now, the right wing would have us believe it's terminal. It's not. It's the product of the last 50, 60 years of bad government decisions by governments of all hue. Labour's crisis today is pretty much a continuation of everything we've seen since the 1950s. Get over it. Now, there isn't time this morning to go through the multiple issues that are being cited for the imminent collapse of the gilts market by the doom scrollers. There is certainly no crisis apparent in the market itself, where gilts auctions have been very well oversubscribed. Now, someone's going to say, yeah, well, that might change. But you know what? Whataboutism is no substitute for proper analysis. Sometime in the next couple of days, I'm going to do more on the gilts market. But my message today is be worried about Paris, but don't lose sleep over London. Let's see what happens next, and still plenty to play for in the gilts and OAT markets. Thank you very much for listening this morning. It's time that I went off and got ready for tomorrow's porridge, which I don't have a clue what it will be about. You can read the Morning Porridge every morning if you subscribe on www.morningporridge.com, and I'll usually follow up with a comment like this at some point every day. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and speak to you all tomorrow.